A very good evening to the audience of this webinar. I am Dr. Arkadeb Dutta. I'm the assistant professor here in RKM in the Department of Sports Science and Yoga. And today I'm going to present a talk whose title is Neural Basis of the Self. So before starting, I must say that we know all that yoga, it offers benefit to both our physical as well as our mental being. But apart from that, if you think that it has a lot of things to offer, it can push the boundaries of one's own capabilities. It can make oneself more self-reliant, I must say that it raises the inner consciousness. As well as it redefines the philosophy of one's life. So when I'm saying about that it offers self-transformation, self-realization, so the thing is, we have to focus on what is self. So my aspect is just to offer some insights into how neuroscience understands the self and the consciousness. Because we know that a lot of work, scientific and research works, they are ongoing. They're going on in order to integrate, in order to bridge the gap between the brain, the consciousness, and the self. So before we understand the consciousness, before we get to know about the self-transformation, that how yoga is actually the philosophy of life, what we say, how we can prove this evidence in the science. So we want to understand in terms of oneself. So let's start this talk. So I have structured my presentation. Go to the next one. On these 4 topics, which I will discuss, that is, what is the self? Why does we need to construct a self at all? What are the possible conceptual experimental approaches of the self? And how does the brain, which is very important, this question, create self? Next. So what is self? Self is actually the awareness of itself. So let us start with few examples. We know about these T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes. These are the cells which are responsible for the immune response. So T cells as a characteristics, we all know that it is an intention, it detects the foreign particles, pathogens, and it attacks it and kills it. At the same time, it has that capacity or the characterize that a self from non-self. That is, which one is a foreign particle and which one is itself, its own identity, so that it cannot destroy itself. So does we call that the T cells as a self? If we think or look at a child, just a newborn child, who can exhibit social reflexive behavior. So what are the social reflexive behavior? It is something like a kind of imitation. If his parents protrude his tongue, then we can see the child also try to protrude the tongue. So this is called a kind of social reflexive behavior. So if a child, newborn child, if it shows this kind of behavior, few months old child, so can we say that the child possesses a self? Similarly, a little bit older child, like of 20, 24 months, when he say that, okay, I want to drink the bottle of water, or drink bottle water me. So those sentences at that time are not so constructive, but still, when he's saying, the child is saying about me, does he understand about the self? So we can see here that self has so many features, so many aspects, if we try to understand. Even animals, if we say that these aspects, we can say that there can be the self-regulation, self-orientation to a stimuli, as well as the self, non-self differentiation. So what are these characteristics with what I have just explained? We can see that even animals also exhibit this kind of characteristics. So what does if we just believe that, okay, these are the features of the selves, and the animals also share the same features. They have also similarly some animals exhibit some kind of social life. So what is actually the self? What we don't, as human beings, don't share with the animals. That is, we don't share one thing, that is our cognitive ability to reflect our own self, in our own self, our own awareness. This we can do, which the animals which cannot do. So thus, we can say that self has at least two major aspects. One, the machinery of the self, which is present in every being, right? The unconscious, unreferenced action of the body, its physiology, information processing related to the cognition and emotion. When we are moving, when we are going around, every time when we don't think, right, that it is I or it is me who is doing this work. So there are kind of unconscious, unreferenced actions like our breathing, which is going on. So there is the machinery of the self. But the mental representation of the self is another feature. That is the idea of me or we. That is the cognitive ability to look at ourselves and the culture that provides the content of the awareness. That we can look, we can reflect our activities, what we are doing, what we are capable of doing. So this makes the representation or the mental representation of the selves. So I here say something, the idea of me or we. Actually, by self, we try to mean that, okay, this is me. But this me and we, it depends, it provides the content, actually the culture which provides the content of our awareness. If we look at the Oriental cultures, Indian cultures and Japanese cultures, it is more like the associative one, that they consider the self as we. In the Westernized culture, we can see that these considerations is made mostly on we, I. Next. So some of aspects of the machinery of the self are self-regulation, self-organization, self-differentiation, as I discussed. So this could have been, we can say that, why are we using this word self-regulation or self-organization, not like system regulation or system organization? So this leads to the question, so what does the self do? Then we have to ask like two such questions. Just assume that what would the child be like if it does not have the self feature? What does mean the self feature? That the self-regulation. So self-regulation, I can give one example, that I'm sitting, I'm giving a talk, this talk, and suddenly my body temperature, it's going on regulating by itself. And suddenly if I feel hungry, that means this is the self feature. So the understanding that I am hungry right now, or I am thirsty right now. So if you think in the terms of a child, that what would the child be like if it does not have the self feature like self-other differentiation or self-reflexive behavior, like I say, that imitative behavior that it catches from its parents. If it does not show it, that can means a serious thing, that its its developmental aspect is not going fine. This we can see in different kind of disorders like autistic disorders and other child developmental disorders. But if we come to another question, that what would happen if the self-awareness or mental representation of me did not emerge? So the first question is something related to much more to the survival, that a child of a particular age who is known to show some kind of self features, if it does not exhibit that feature of machinery of the self, that means it can pose some kind of threatening threats to its survival. But if a child is not aware of its self-awareness, of its mental representation of me, so what does it mean? So it doesn't project that what it is doing. It cannot make the its own cognitive ability to look at itself. So that means we can say on the emotional part that more complicated emotional features like empathy and we can say also the pride as well as embarrassments, maybe this will not develop into that child, but that does not pose any threat to its survival. So now, into the next slide, when I will move, I will say a little bit elaborately. Yeah. So what does the cell actually do? These are so many functions we can see. The self is able to do a representation, the labeling of stimulus as self-referential, monitoring of self-referential stimuli, integration, that is linkage of a stimulus to the personal context, self-awareness, agency, ownership, unity, mind reading, spatial perspectivity, emotions, autobiographical memory. So these are all the things a self can do. So now, in the next slide, we have to understand more about the concepts of the self and their experimental realization. So what are the context-based concepts of the self? Self can be classified into three types. One is the physical self or the proto-self. Another is the core on the mental self and the spiritual self. So here I will just go a little bit into the definition of each of them. So what is proto-self? The proto-self or physical self is outline of one's body in affective and sensory motor terms. So we know that this is my body, this is our body. Sensory motor feedback loops are crucial, involving in generating a sense of self, definitely. So we have our proprioceptive information inputs. From here, we can find that, okay, I am moving, this is me. So this is a kind of outline of one's own existence, or the body existence. Now, what is the mental self or the core self? Mental self, as I have said, that is the mental representation of me. So it is defined by its mental contents and it's associated with the cognitive contents. As I explained earlier, mental self is not restricted to the parts of its own body. So I can see my mental self out of body also. Like if someone utters my name or shows my picture, I can identify this. So I have a mental representation of me, and that mental representation of me may also concern stimuli from outside the body and the person who is concerned. So what is spiritual self then? The spiritual or self or narrative self includes the autobiographical memories of further entails the concept of time, more specifically the subjective experience of time and episodic memory that a person goes throughout his life. He gathers experiences. He gathers many memories of instances and facts. So each mental representations, it is formed as a total in the temporal existence, in the temporal time span, in the time span. And this forms the autobiographical dimension, which impacts the ability later on to judge specific stimuli as either self or non-self specific in her life. So in certain aspects, when the person was young, he has taken some kind of stimuli differently when in comparison when he has become older. So this kind of autobiographical dimension can be inputted into ourself through regular experiences of time. So these different contents provide the basis of current neuroscience to neuronalizing the cell based on their content. So can we see the neuronal correlates of each of these context-based self, like the bodily self, like the mental self, or the spiritual self? The answer we will try to find out from the next slides. So what unites the different context-based concept of self? Self-referential thing, that is, they estimate the degree of the stimulus closeness to the one person. So this is the feature that we have said that these are the three different context-based, content-based concepts, right? The bodily self, the core self, and the autobiographical self. So what unites all this self together in the particular self? So that means the self-referential, whatever you are looking at into the stimuli, if it is familiar to you, then you are referencing it. That is to yourself, that is self-referential. So what you are doing is that you are judging, you are making a general evaluations. So most of these non-self analysis in the context of human behavior and in the context of understanding the neural correlates, those experiments are done with functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. So some of these examples we can say that we can show some subjects the sets of pictures of themselves or their close friends versus the pictures of some strangers. And we say that you can give a grade or ranking to the degree of closeness or association with the pictures. Then we can also find the examples like when we present the house where we spent our childhood versus the pictures of any unknown house. So then we can see that how they can relate the closeness of these two type of paradigms, the experiments. So here we can see that the focus of the role of making judgments raises the role of self-consciousness or self-awareness. Definitely, when you are judging, when you are making a general evaluation of the thing, that which is self-referential, that means you are very much aware of yourself, that which house you have spent your childhood versus the pictures of unknown houses. So the brain areas which are activated in these cases are the cortical midline structures and some cortical areas, which will I come into the previous later slides. But first of all, we have to understand that this is the self when one is judging or self-evaluating. So what does the actual self or the inner self lies? This is the self when one is making a judgment, kind of mental representation. If someone is showing his picture, then he can say, okay, this is my picture, which is not, I mean, to be compulsory to be within inside its body. It can be any stimulus outside. So this kind of judgment and evaluation which are coming from the midline structure so far cannot tell the actual existence of the inner self. So what is inner self? So I will say in the next slide, what are the alternatives for tapping an implicit self? So here I will just explain one of very important fMRI study. We know what is functional magnetic resonance imaging. It actually indirectly captures the neural activities of the parts of the brain. This is what fMRI does. So it is believed that when a person does some task, that area which is related to that task, it gets activated, the neuronal firing, it triggers the homeostatic, the hemodynamic responses, and the blood oxygen parameter levels, it changes, and this captures the signals. So this is much more technical. So this is how we look at, when we look into the brain, those blobs. Here you can see these red areas, those are the activated areas. So here, this special experiment which I wanted to say is that this experiment was done first on healthy human beings, and next on the patients who are in minimal conscious state or in vegetative states. So we know that what is vegetative state. A vegetative state means only the person, the patient is able to breathe. It can go through its sleep cycles, but it cannot conduct or continue a kind of communication with the external world. So that means the vegetative state. So first of all, what they did is that in this experiment, the experimenters presented auditory stimulus. That is here SON means the subject's own name with an unknown voice, and a familiar name with an unknown voice, with an English name with an unknown voice, and a non-familiar name which is not shown with an unknown voice. So this is actually called, this paradigm is actually called the event-related design fMRI. So you can see here that the sound or this name has been evoked, and after between 4 to 12 seconds, then another randomly assigned stimulus, like it can be a familiar name under the by an unfamiliar voice, or an unfamiliar name with an unfamiliar voice, it can also be presented. So this goes on randomly and through repetitions, and they collect the data in this event-related design. And what they found is that, one thing is that these subjects were told not to make any judgment, just to perceive the names that the system of the speaker is uttering. So at this time, what they see that without any judgment or evaluation, these areas, which is actually the anterior part of the anterior cingulate cortex, as well as the supplementary motor areas, which are very much the midline cortical structures, these are activated. And below in B, we can see the parameter estimates in these three areas, where we can see the green colored bar, it shows more response signals when the person listens to his own name through an unknown voice, in comparison to a familiar name, an unknown voice, and an unknown name with the unknown voice. So here we can see that the anterior part of the anterior cingulate cortex, it shows much more responses. Next slide. So next, what they did is that they repeated this experiments in the patients who are in the minimal conscious states and vegetative states. So here what they did is that they did presented a block design where a familiar voice is uttering the patient's name for 12 seconds, and then there was 12-second rest, and again the same name, and 12 seconds rest. So this is called the block design in fMRI. And then by comparing this rest and the activity, they found out that interestingly, these patients which are in the vegetative state or minimal conscious states, they even, right, because they don't have that function to respond to the judge. They cannot judge, they cannot evaluate, but still this area is active whenever the name of the patients has been uttered. So there is a kind of perception which is going on in these patients too, in the minimally vegetative states or minimal conscious states. So this area is the anterior cingulate cortex. So now we know that the inner self somehow lies in this area. And in the lower graph, you can see here, it's a correlation where you can see the parameter estimates in the caudal ACC, and with the scores of the conscious rating scale. So you can see that this, with the conscious rating scale, the signal level relationship is directly proportional. So here we can see in the B and C, these are the areas which are activated in the patients. So the triangles, it shows those patients who are in minimal conscious states, and the circles are who are in the vegetative states. So interestingly, what comes out from these experiments is that these patients with vegetative state and who are minimally conscious still can respond. So some activities are still going on in that midline areas, which determines the self. Next slide. So what is the neural activity in this cortical midline structure specific for it? It is neither self-specific, contains or not a general evaluation function, because these patients cannot evaluate, as I say. This patient could not be able to evaluate between self and non-self stimuli, but still these areas are activated. So what does this neural activity mean? So any stimuli, be the bodily, mental or autobiographical, must first be related to the organism in order for the latter to be able to access the former as specific content, be it self or non-self specific. So before, the simpler thing to understand is that before making any judgment or evaluation, the thing that is, whatever the stimuli is, should be related to the organism. And this relation is actually, prior to the evaluation or the judgment, is done in these midline cortical structures. So what underlies this is that we cannot say this as the neural correlates. Why? Neural correlates are something that when you are showing a stimuli or a stimulus, you are getting a response. Then you can say that, okay, this response is, or this stimuli is correlated with this particular response. But here, the patients were not in the state of making any kind of this judgment or evaluatory behavior. So what does this neural activity mean? So this neural activity actually means the predisposition of the self, that it is making the stage to make the evaluation or the judgment of the mental representation of the self. So what does this neural activity mean? So these are not the rest to stimulus interaction. So these are called the resting state activity. What we know about is the default mode network activity. Next slide. So here is the default mode network. So what is default mode network? Default mode network means it is called the task negative activity. The subject lies on the scanner without any task, and just he has to rest. That's it. And in the resting state, we find this kind of activities. You can say here with this heat map, which are generated in the posterior part of the cingulate cortex, as well as in the anterior cingulate cortex. And the entire thing you can see here is the midline structures, cortical structures. So this is the default mode network. And actually, now science is saying that this default mode network is entraining or modulating the other midline cortical structures, which are also responsible for the exteroceptive responses, like the subject-object interaction. Next slide. So the self is the unity of consciousness in perception, and the action persists in the time. So how does the brain create and maintain the self? So the brain creates the self through three dissociable hierarchical systems. One is the intero-self, another is the extero-self system, another is the integrative self system. So first of all, we have to understand that we say about consciousness, we say about the perception, we say about the action, and which persists in the time. So the self is actually the unity of this consciousness. What kind of consciousness? One is, we can say, the conscious awareness. Another is just the implicit consciousness, which rests in that area, that is the anterior caudal part of this anterior cingulate cortex, as I say, the midline structures in the default mode networks. So brain creates this self through these three dissociable hierarchical system. Now I will come into these three dissociable hierarchical system. These are, you can see, this is actually one of the sketch which shows the midline. And here we can say that this system has an exterosensory system, which is peripherally arranged. The heteromodal or integrative system is in between the paralimbic or the intero-self system. That this can also be further better understand by the next slide. So the three hierarchical systems which create the self, a model. The three systems exhibited two major neuroanatomical patterns of organization. One is the radial pattern, if you look at, another is the rostrocaudal pattern. So what is the radial pattern? Radial pattern is just like the growth rings of a tree, right? So here in the center, if you think about the neural axis, now from the center, we can see these three structures are radiating outside from the interior to the medial. So the interior milieu, or we can say that the intero-self, it consists of these paracord, medial lateral paracord structures. So what are these structures? These structures actually mainly rest in the brainstem and in the caudal direction. And as we go into the rostral direction, we can find these areas into the paralimbic and corticolimbic zones. So the extero-self, we can see the outer side. Extero-self means which helps us to understand the environment where we are living through our primary sensory cortices, the sensory receptors, our own five sensations. So these includes the primary sensory motor cortices and the unibodal association areas. And in between the exterosensory systems and the intero-self, we have an integrative self system. So these integrate the intero-self and the exterosensory motor systems. That is, I is the intero-self, and where am I? That is it is also very important. The environment which shapes me, it is understand the environment, that is the exterosensory motor system. So these two things are being integrated in between structures, which we call as the medial heteromodal association cortex or medial paralimbic cortex. So if we look at the rostrocaudal pattern on the right side, then we can see that the spinal cord, brainstem, they actually, which occupies the core, these areas are more located caudally, and the limbic paralimbic cores, like the caudal orbitofrontal cortex, parahippocampal areas, anterior cingulate, anterior insula, these are located more rostrally. But these are the part of the intero-self. Now into the next slide, a little bit of understanding is that here is the scan of a brain scan, MRI image of a person, where you can see the rostrocaudal direction. So if we look at the forehead, this is actually the rostral direction. And if we go behind, this is the caudal directions. And in the radial pattern, we can see that in the brainstem, the crosshair is projected. So it's more or less in the neural axis, the axis, the direction in which the nervous system is going on. And from there, we can see the medial part is located close towards the axis and the lateral parts are outside towards the periphery. Next. So what does the inter-self system does? What is its function? The inter-self is specialized, therefore, for the processing and the awareness of aspects of the self that partly to homeostatic internal processes, self-preservation, motivation, and some kind of emotions, like we can say fear, feeling of fear, or feeling of hunger. So these kind of things which is happening inside inter-self processes these neural informations, the awareness of yourself, your internal processes which are going on. When you are hungry, that means your inter-self is saying you are hungry. When you are kind of a mental pain, then your inter-self is saying that this pain is from something like inside. So this is how, when you are getting motivated, this motivation is also, scientists says that it is also aspect of the inter-self system, that is the brainstem and the paralimbic areas. So what does the extrasensory system does? It creates the mental externalization of the stimuli, self-object discrimination, possibly a quality of mind that is critical for the creation of the consciousness and the self. So this is very important, that where you exist, it is important to separate yourself from the existence. So these things is actually done by the extrasensory motor system. And what is the integrative self system? The integrative self system plays a third and possibly determining role in the creation of the self. These regions serves as a convergence zone. The highest, most advanced aspects of the self are organized within the integrative self system, where the two trends converge. That you have a self, yourself, or your inner self, and this inner self is communicating with the exterior, the world you are. Right. So this integration is made by this integrative self system, which are the heteronodal areas of the brain. Now, the next questions, we have now got into the idea of, okay, what is self? How do we define self? What are the aspects of this self? And if we look at the aspects of the self, previously, most of these fMRI studies, which was actually the only reliable method in order to understand the human aspects of brain and in its behavior, it shows that most of the studies were reliable on the human judgmental and evaluatory behavior of the self. So it was something like self-referential, but not self-related. So in order to understand the self-related self, the judgmental part, prior to the judgmental part, the perceptual part was tried, and it shows that in the patients, I am just recapping, who are in the minimally conscious and vegetative state, they also shows that area, the midline areas, which represents the kind of activities, what we call as the resting state activity, which is there, or the ongoing activity, neural activity, which is independent of the stimulus and subject in the stimulus and the person interaction. So these things also goes on there. So now we try to find out, okay, so we have an inner self, we understand the mental representation of the self. So there is an unification going on. So this mental, bodily self and spiritual self, what are these areas? Where does the brain, how does the brain create this self? So now we try to understand, okay, so phylogenetically, evolutionarily, we can see that there are three distinct parts or regions we classified. That according to this model, these are the inter-self, extrasensory self, and the integrative self. And inter-self means that it maintains the homeostatic internal processes like temperature regulation, sleep, hunger. It also has a kind of motivations, as also the emotions in case of survival and related to survival. And the extrasensory system is much more understanding of the self-object discrimination, and the integrative systems, it integrates and makes a convergence convergence zone of the most advanced aspects of the self, which now I will discuss. So here you can see this through this cone, which is an inverted cone. So brainstem, lies in the most caudal part, which forms the core and the paracore. So we know there's brainstem, then the medial greater limbic system, medial cortical limbic system, medial paralimbic system. So these actually forms the inter-self. And here what we are seeing parallelly, those lines which are going to the primary sensory areas. So with those bidirectional arrows, we can see these are actually the external-sensory motor system. And in between that, the heteromodal system, it is actually integrating both these cells. So now, in the next slide, we have to understand what is the basis of this perception. Because at the first I have told, given a definition, that self is the unity of consciousness in perception, in action, and across time. So, how does this unity or unification of percept takes place? Taking into account that if we think that anything is conscious, if anything is conscious around us, that all these conscious things should have a common structure and function. What kind of structure function? The structurality and functionality of nestedness and neural hierarchy. So the things in the universe which possess the nestedness and neural hierarchy, we can say that they possess the consciousness. They have consciousness, and no things without these structures are conscious. So we have to understand these three figures or three outlines here, diagrams. So what is A is a non-nested hierarchy, and the biological nested hierarchy, and the neural nested hierarchy. So in the non-nested hierarchy, you can see the top rank, or I can say, in this case, we can take an example, a metaphor like an army. In an army, we can know the general is at the top, and the lower ranks, they obey their order. So the general, he gives the command to his subordinates. The subordinates further give his commands to the later subordinates into the lowest ranks. So the general occupies the highest or central part of this hierarchy, and he is not the physically combined or related to this hierarchy. But in biological nested hierarchy, what we will see, look at this organ. This is actually a liver. So if you look at the liver, it starts from a very unique structure, cell. A cell also has its organelles. Now, a collection of cells makes this hepatic tissue, and this hepatic tissue finally makes an organ. So in this kind of hierarchy, we can see the hierarchy reaches to the top level, which is the organ, and it starts at the organelles level. But this hierarchy here, actually the constituent parts, these constituent parts are nested, that it is resting inside the bigger part. So it is a physical component within this, the unified component within this hierarchy. So our nervous system, it possesses both this non-nested as well as the biologically nested hierarchy system. So if we consider an organized organism with without a nervous system, so it will resemble a biological nested hierarchy simply. But if we consider the organism with the nervous system, we can see there's both these two hierarchies together. That is the non-nested and the biological hierarchy. So before going, one thing we have to understand is that in non-nested hierarchy, we have to see that there is more strong constraint of the higher rank on the lower rank. But in the biological nested hierarchy, the constraint is very weak, because here the general, what the command he will give, it must be followed by the lowest rank. But here the constraint by the total organ, that is the liver on individual organelle, is very low. Rather, the particular cell which determine the function of each of the organelles, like the mitochondria. But the organ can have its constraint on the cells, but not on the organelles. So this is how we can see that the constraint of the top level here is becoming weaker and weaker on the lowest rank, which is not happening in the non-nested hierarchy. So in the next slide, we will try to elaborate these things. So we have spoken about the systems, that is the sensory systems, the external sensory motor system. So here you can see the retina, it captures the image of an apple. Fine. So it goes into these streams, we can see the upstream and downstream areas. The upstream areas, we can see this is the lateral geniculate nucleus in the schematic diagram shows the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Then it reaches the visual cortex, that is the V1 area. From there, there are two streams that bifurcate from there. One is the MT, that is area, another is the dorsal parietal area. And another stream which comes here is the V2, V4, and the ventral temporal pathway. So now if we look at these integration areas, that is the heteromodal areas. So what does these heteromodal areas do? It does. First, in any kind of sensory system, the function of a primary area is to extract the primary feature of an image. So here the image is, suppose, the world we are interacting. We are actually much more, we are visual animals much more, right? So we interact with our world visually. If we interact with our world visually, so we get every images, and the world is presented in front of us, to ourselves as a unified person, right? So how this unified person is created in the brain? My point is, so this percept, if you see, go through the hierarchy. So the brain is also maintains this kind of non-nested hierarchical structures, like the lower ranks, which are the upstream structures, and the higher ranks, like the V4, V2, and the ventral temporal pathway, and there the dorsal parietal pathway, which processes much more complex abstract features of the stimulus. So an apple as an apple, when we understand it, it has many basic features, like the orientation of the apple. So if you see, if you try to record the V1 areas from the visual cortex, what will you see is that the visual cortex and the V1 area of the visual cortex will only understand the orientation of the line that is making the apple. So if we consider this apple, so we can see this, the outline or the borderline of apple is made up of innumerable straight lines, right? Like a circle is made up of very small straight lines. So similarly, these straight lines are differentially oriented. So in the V1 areas, if we look, that this area is actually responsible for the orientation specific objects, right? So what is the orientation of a stimuli? So it detects only that in a very small receptive field, but it doesn't understand that what these outlines or the lines are for. Is it belongs to apple? No, it doesn't understand that. So who understands that this is an apple? So the ventral temporal pathway, the V4, and the more upstream areas, things are become more getting complicated, complex, and the complicated features are getting understood here. Now, for example, if I say an example that if you look at a face, the face responsive areas are in more ventral areas of this visual cortex. So if you put the record or put the electrode in the ventral areas and try to understand what is happening, then you can see that these face responsive cells or this face responsive area, they doesn't have any specific receptive field. They don't know where this face is coming from, but they only identify the face. But in order to understand where this face is coming from or any other particular features which are making this face in totality, one has to go into the more upstream regions. So now, similarly, if you see that the apple is made up of red colors, these red shades, they are also different at different part of this apple. So these each patches of informations, they are integrated in V4, and then it goes into the ventral temporal pathway, into the further higher areas of downstream areas where the unified percept of apple is received. But who makes this binding? Who makes this binding of these lines with these colors of patches, with this that the unified concept that what I am looking at is an apple? Who binds it? Now, in the next slide, we will see that it is actually the neuronal oscillations. The oscillations which are going on in the brain. So I have put an example of the sensory motor system in order to make you understand that the whole thing, the same thing also runs when we try to integrate the inner self with our outer self. Suppose if a pin is pricked on our hand, we, from our external sensory motor system, we understand that that is a pin which is hurting, which has inflicted the pain, but the pain is coming from inside. So this is how the percept is getting unified. And for unification of the percept, the system not only have to be hierarchical in the sense, but also to be nested, that it should be a component in that system. And the nervous system and brain, it actually offers the both. That is the non-nested hierarchy, like the centralization in the of the top rank as we move up, as well as the nested system. So here we can see the oscillations. So these oscillations will have to be synchronized in terms of the different regions of the brain. We have to look at the different regions of the brain. We have to see where the unifier, when the image of the apple, where the image of the apple is perceived, and where those lines or the orientations are perceived, how those neuronal oscillations or neuronal activities are correlated. So this kind of neural oscillations or synchronization needs to be understood in order to get the whole percept of similarly the whole percept of the unified cell. So we have to understand the external sensory motor areas and the inter-cell together, if there is any technology, in order to understand that how this perceptual binding is actually taking place. So this is the picture which I'm showing. So this is a nice picture which is showing a part of the hippocampus. A hippocampus, we know that it shows, it is responsible for encoding the memory, the post-episodic memory. So what looks from here is, if you look at that, it looks like a telescopic image at of something like a planet and this hot color, but actually these are the neurons. So this 1, 2, 3, 4 neurons, their firing, I wanted to mean, were synchronous when the animal is learning something or memorizing a task. So this kind of synchronization actually needs to take place in the brain whenever we are making this kind of convergence of our self, the inner self, with the outer. So, in the next slide. Some thoughts is that the nervous system that constructs an integrated consciousness and ultimately what we call the self, and a biologically hierarchical organization increases the number of its constituent and differentiated parts, and at the same time achieves greater degrees of nested centralization and top-down constraints, adding complexity to the system, which leads from consciousness to self and ultimately to self-awareness. So a system to be conscious did not have to be random, or neither it has to be very regular like a crystal structure. It should exhibit some kind of complex features, and the hierarchy will be there with the nested structures. And these nested structures do mean that there will be some kind of synchronized activity between these structures, which will show a kind of conscious perception of one's own self and the environment. Thank you. Any questions are welcome. Okay, so if you don't have questions, so I hope you understand the meaning of this talk.